Lean in a little closer to the fire. You feel that heat on your face? It's a good heat. It's a safe heat. But I want you to forget this cool night air for a second. Imagine this. It's March 1898. You're standing in a part of East Africa that the locals call Tsavo. Now, in their language, that word doesn't mean beautiful plains or river, land. It literally translates to the place of slaughter. Think about that for a second. Before a single rail was laid, before the British even showed up with their maps and their ego, the people who lived there already knew what this land was. It was a graveyard. The ground isn't dirt like we have here. It's this fine, blood-red dust that gets into everything. Your eyes, your throat, your pores. And the plants? It isn't a lush jungle. It's what they call the Nika. It's miles and miles of these gray, twisted thorn bushes. These things don't have leaves. They have 3-inch needles that hook into your skin and don't let go. It's a landscape that wants to tear you apart just for walking through it. And the heat, man, the heat was something else. It was the kind of heat that cooks you from the inside out. It shimmered off the ground until your eyes started playing tricks on you. Into this hellscape, the British Empire decided to shove a railroad. They wanted to connect the coast to Lake Victoria, 1,000 miles of track through some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. They called it the Uganda Railway. But the newspapers back in London had a different name for it, the Lunatic Express. Why? Because you had to be a straight-up lunatic to think you could tame this place. But the British didn't care. They brought in thousands of workers, mostly from India, and they started an invasion. Imagine the noise. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was the rhythmic thud of thousands of axes chopping down the Nika. It was the deafening crack of dynamite blowing apart ancient rock. It was the constant high-pitched scream of steam engines. They were building an iron snake through the place of slaughter, and they thought they were the masters of the world. That's when our guy shows up, John Henry Patterson. Patterson was exactly the kind of man the Empire loved. He was a colonel, an engineer, and a world-class hunter. He'd spent time in India. He knew how to handle a rifle, and he walked off that train with his chin held high. He wasn't there to be scared. He was there to build a bridge over the Tsavo River. To him, this was just a job. A difficult job, sure, but he had science. He had modern technology, and he had a .303 Lee Enfield rifle. In his mind, he was the apex predator. He set up his tent, organized the camps, and started giving orders. He looked at the red dust and the gray thorns and saw a problem to be solved, not a place to be feared. But the locals, they knew better. They came to him early on. They'd stand in the shadows of his lantern light, eyes wide, whispering about spirits. They told him that the land was angry. They said the spirits of the ancient chiefs who were buried there didn't want the iron snake. They warned him that there were demons in the bush that didn't like the noise of the dynamite. Patterson just laughed. He was a man of the 19th century. He believed in steel and steam, not ghosts and legends. He told them to get back to work. He thought their fear was just superstition, the kind of thing civilized men like him had outgrown. He thought he was safe because he had a gun. Here's where it gets weird. For the first few days, everything was fine. The bridge started to take shape. The heat was brutal, but the work was moving. Then the sun went down on a Tuesday, and the atmosphere changed. The night didn't just get dark, it got heavy. The kind of silence where you can hear the blood pumping in your own ears. In one of the worker camps, there was a man named Ungan Singh. He was a powerful guy, a Sikh Jemadar, basically a foreman. He was well respected, strong, and not the type of person who got spooked easily. He was sleeping in a tent with a dozen other men. The tents were grouped together for safety. Fires were burning, and there were guards posted. In the middle of the night, something happened. Or rather, something didn't happen. There was no scream. There was no sound of a struggle. There wasn't even the sound of a footstep. The men sleeping next to Ungan Singh woke up because they felt a sudden draft of cold air. One of them reached out for his friend, and his hand hit the empty ground. Ungan Singh was just gone. Now, imagine you're Patterson. You get woken up at dawn by a group of terrified workers. They're shaking, pointing toward the edge of the camp. You grab your rifle, thinking maybe a deserting worker stole something, or maybe a stray leopard wandered in. You walk over to Ungan Singh's tent. You look at the ground. There are no footprints from a struggle, but there, in the soft red dust at the entrance of the tent, you see it. A long, wide depression in the dirt, a drag mark. Patterson followed it. He pushed through the whistling thorn bushes, the needles catching on his sleeves. The sun was just starting to bleed over the horizon, turning everything a sickly orange. About 100 yards into the scrub, he found what was left. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't a clean kill. It wasn't just an animal looking for a quick meal. It was like something had toyed with him. But the thing that stopped Patterson's heart, the thing that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up for the first time, was the realization of the sheer power involved. Ungan Singh was a big man, probably 200 pounds of solid muscle, and something had reached into a tent full of sleeping men, grabbed him by the head, and pulled him out through a hole it had ripped in the heavy canvas. It had carried him, not dragged, carried over a thorn fence that was 4 feet high, without leaving a single tuft of hair or a drop of blood on the thorns. It had moved like a ghost. Patterson stood there in the red dust, looking at the remains of his best worker, and for the first time, he looked at his modern high-powered rifle. For the first time, it felt very small. The place of slaughter had just claimed its first victim of the railroad. And the worst part, whatever did this wasn't done. It was just getting a taste for what was now on the menu. The iron snake had stopped in its tracks. "Put another log on the fire, will you? The light's getting a bit thin, and I don't know about you, but the way those shadows are dancing against the trees is starting to mess with my head. Last time we talked, I told you about Ungan Singh, the big man who just vanished. Well, you'd think that would be enough to make everyone pack up and run, right? But you have to understand the mind of a man like John Henry Patterson. He was a British officer, an engineer. He believed in things you could measure with a ruler or calculate with a slide rule. To him, the world was a logical place. So, his first reaction to a man being snatched out of a tent, it wasn't monsters, it was denial. He stood there in the red dust, looking at that empty tent, and he told himself a story. He told the workers to stay calm. He told them that maybe Ungan Singh had a debt he couldn't pay, and was murdered by a rival. Or, at worst, it was just a random leopard, a one-time thing, a fluke. He looked those terrified Indian workers in the eye and basically told them they were being dramatic. "It's just one incident," he said. He wanted to believe that, because if it was just one incident, he could control it. If it was just a murder, he could find the killer. But if it was something else, well, he wasn't ready to go there yet. Imagine this. You're one of those workers. You're miles from home, in a land that feels like it's trying to swallow you whole. You're living in a camp that isn't really a camp. It's just thousands of flimsy canvas tents scattered across miles of that gray, thorny scrub. There are no walls, no real doors, just a flap of cloth between you and the place of slaughter. At night, the camp was never actually quiet. You'd hear the rhythmic snoring of 3,000 men. You'd hear someone coughing from the dust. You'd hear the wind rattling the canvas, making it sound like someone was whispering just outside your tent. It feels safe because there are so many of you. You think, there's no way it'll pick me, but that's the thing about the dark. It makes you feel small and visible at the same time. A few nights went by. The denial started to set in. People started to relax just a little bit. Maybe the colonel was right. Maybe it was just a leopard that moved on. Then it happened again. But this time, it wasn't silent. Here's where it gets weird. In a camp a few hundred yards away from Patterson's, a man woke up. Not because of a scream, but because of a sound he couldn't identify. It was a low, wet thwack, like someone had dropped a heavy soaked sponge on the floor. He sat up in his bedroll. He could hear the man next to him breathing. Short, shallow gasps. Then he heard it. Ripe. The heavy canvas of the tent didn't just tear, it exploded. There was no growl, no roar, just the sound of something massive, moving with a terrifying, focused purpose. Then came a muffled scream, the kind of sound someone makes when the air is being squeezed out of their lungs. The man in the tent scrambled for a lantern, his hand shaking so hard he almost broke the glass. By the time he got a light going, the side of the tent was wide open, fluttering in the night breeze. His friend's bedroll was empty. This time, the camp didn't wait for morning to panic. The shouting started, torches were lit, and the sound of whistles cut through the air. Patterson came running, clutching his rifle, his face pale in the flickering firelight. He didn't say murder this time. He didn't say leopard. The next morning, the sun came up hot and angry, like it always did. Patterson went out to find the trail. He was a hunter, remember? He knew how to read the ground. He expected to see the scratch, marks of a leopard, or maybe the dragging paws of a small lion. He found the pug marks, the footprints, in the red dust. He stopped. He knelt down, and he didn't move for a long time. Imagine this. Patterson puts his hand down next to the footprint. His hand, a grown man's hand, doesn't even cover the center of it. These weren't normal lion prints. They were massive, deep. The weight of the animal had packed the dust down like a sledgehammer hitting the earth. And then he saw the second set of tracks. It wasn't one lion. It was two. They had moved in perfect synchronization. While one stood guard, the other had reached into the tent. They weren't hunting like animals. They were hunting like a tactical team. And they were huge. bigger than any lion Patterson had ever seen in the books. He followed the trail into the Nika, into those gray thorn bushes. The dust was stained, not with a lot of blood. These things were too efficient for that, but with just enough to show the way. He pushed through a thicket, his rifle held tight against his shoulder, his heart drumming a rhythm against his ribs. The air was dead still. Then he saw something. He found a small clearing where the thorns were matted down. There, lying in the center of the red dust, were a pair of leather boots. They weren't tossed aside. They hadn't been pulled off. They were still laced up, but they were empty. Next to them, he found a small brass ring that one of the workers used to wear. It was twisted, crushed by a force that no human could replicate. That was the moment the horror really set in for Patterson. He realized he wasn't dealing with a pest. He wasn't dealing with a territorial animal. He realized that these two lions, the ghost and the darkness, had figured something out. They had realized that the British Empire had spent millions of pounds and brought thousands of men to Tsavo just to provide them with a feast. The Iron Snake wasn't a railroad anymore. To those lions, it was an all-you-can-eat buffet. And the worst part, they weren't hiding. The tracks didn't lead away from the camp. They circled it. They were still there, watching, waiting for the sun to go down again. Patterson looked back at his half-finished bridge, then at the empty boots, and he finally understood. He wasn't the hunter. He was the one being hunted. The place of slaughter was finally living up to its name. So, Patterson has found the empty boots. He's found the ring. He's realized that his modern world is being dismantled by something in the tall grass. But up until this point, he hasn't actually seen them. He's only seen what they leave behind. And believe me, the imagination is a lot worse than the reality, until the reality actually shows up. Imagine this. It's a few nights after the second attack. Patterson is done playing defense. He builds what they call a mashan. It's basically a tiny wooden platform tied high up in a tree. He's got his rifle, a tin of cold tea, and enough nerves to fill a graveyard. He's sitting there, perfectly still. The mosquitoes are eating him alive, but he doesn't dare swat them. He's just a shadow in a tree, waiting for a shadow on the ground. The moon finally clears the horizon. It's one of those big African moons that turns the red dust into a pale, ghostly white. The thorn bushes look like twisted skeletal hands reaching out of the earth. Everything is silver and black. Then he hears it, a soft crack. It's the sound of a dry twig snapping, not under a heavy boot, but under a soft, padded paw. Patterson slowly levels his rifle. His heart is hammering against his ribs, so hard he's worried the vibration might shake the tree. And then they step into the moonlight. Patterson almost drops his gun. He expected lions, sure. He'd hunted lions in India. He knew what they looked like, the big regal manes, the golden fur. But it wasn't just an animal down there. These things, they looked wrong. Here's where it gets weird. The Tsavo lions were different. They were maneless. Imagine a male lion, huge, muscular, powerful, but with a completely bald head and neck. They looked like giant lionesses on steroids, but with a prehistoric, meaner look to them. Because they didn't have manes, they didn't look like the king of the jungle. They looked like sleek, killing machines. Without that hair, you could see every single muscle rippling under their skin like snakes coiled under a carpet. They were massive, easily 10 feet from nose to tail, and their skin was scarred and dark. In that silver moonlight, they didn't even look like they were made of flesh. They looked like they were carved out of the very rock and shadow of Tsavo. They moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that made them almost invisible the second they stepped near a bush. But the physical part wasn't the scariest bit. It was how they acted. See, male lions usually hate each other. They fight over territory. They fight over pride. If you see two males together, they're usually brothers, and even then, they're clumsy. But these two, they moved like a SWAT team. Patterson watched from his tree, paralyzed. One lion stayed in the deep shadows of the thorns, barely moving, just a pair of glowing yellow eyes reflecting the moon. He was the distraction. The other one, the bigger one, started a wide, silent circle around the camp. They were communicating without making a sound. One would flush the prey out, and the other would be waiting at the exit. It wasn't natural. It wasn't animal behavior. It was tactical. It was like they were reading Patterson's mind. They knew where the guards were. They knew where the fires were low. The next morning, the news spread through the camp like a wildfire. Patterson tried to describe what he saw, but the workers didn't need his descriptions. They had already made up their minds. They stopped calling them lions. You don't call something a lion when it leaps over a 10-foot thorn fence, snatches a man out of a locked rail car, and vanishes before a single bullet can hit it. They gave them names that matched the terror, the ghost, and the darkness. Think about those names for a second. They called the first one the Ghost because he was the one you never saw coming. He was the one who could walk through a camp of 3,000 men, bypass every trap, and leave nothing but a blood stain where a person used to be. You'd fire your rifle at a movement in the grass, and there would be nothing there, just the wind. They called the second one the Darkness, because he was the weight you felt in the air before the attack. He was the one who waited in the blackest parts of the night, the one who seemed to swallow the light of the campfires. The workers weren't just scared anymore. They were broken. They started saying that bullets wouldn't work. They'd seen Patterson and the other officers fire point blank into the bushes, and the lions would just melt away. No yelp of pain, no blood trail, nothing. And this is where the stories really started to turn dark. The locals, the ones who had lived in the place of slaughter long before the British arrived, with their iron snake, pulled Patterson aside. They didn't talk about animals or biology. They told him that these weren't lions at all. They believed they were shaitani, demons. Specifically, they believed these were the angry spirits of ancient kings who had been buried in the Tsavo Valley centuries ago. To the locals, the railroad wasn't progress. It was an insult. It was a scar across their history. And these lions were the kings come back to life, taking a tax in human flesh for every mile of track laid. Patterson was a man of science. He was a soldier. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to tell them they were crazy. But then he'd look down at his hands, and he'd realize they were shaking. He'd remember the way those two manless demons looked at each other in the moonlight. He'd remember the way they didn't roar. Lions are supposed to roar, right? But these two were silent. They didn't want to scare you. They just wanted to eat you. He looked at the bridge, then he looked at the red, dusty horizon where the ghost and the darkness were hiding. And for the first time in his life, John Henry Patterson, the hunter, the hero of the empire, started to wonder if he was actually fighting something that couldn't be killed by a bullet. The iron snake had stopped moving. The lunatic express was stuck in the throat of something much older and much hungrier than a railroad, and the sun was starting to go down again. You hear that? That's just the fire popping, I hope. Lean in closer. I mean it. This is the part where the civilized world finally realized that Tsavo didn't care about rank, uniforms, or titles. By now, the camp was a pressure cooker. The workers were losing their minds. The bridge was stalled, and word had reached the higher-ups that the lunatic express was being shut down by a couple of cats. The British government wasn't embarrassed. They were furious. So they sent in a heavy hitter. Enter District Officer Whitehead. Imagine this. Whitehead was the embodiment of the British Empire. He was a big, imposing guy in a crisp uniform decorated with medals, carrying a heavy-duty rifle, and accompanied by his loyal right-hand man, Sergeant Abdullah. He wasn't some scared laborer. He was the boss. He arrived at the Tsavo station on the evening train, stepping onto the platform with that arrogant stride people have when they think they own the dirt. They're standing on. He looked at the nervous guards and the flickering torches and probably scoffed. To him, this was a management problem. He figured Patterson just needed a firm hand to settle the locals and shoot a couple of oversized strays. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, turning the sky that bruised purplish color you only see in the desert. The train hissed out a final cloud of steam and chugged away, leaving Whitehead and Abdullah standing on the platform. It was only a short walk from the station to Patterson's main camp, maybe a few hundred yards of open ground. Whitehead adjusted his hat, gripped his rifle, and told Abdullah to follow him. He thought he was safe because he was an officer. He thought he was safe because he had a gun. But the ghost and the darkness, they didn't care about his commission. Here's where it gets weird. It was almost like they had been checking the train schedule. They weren't hunting in the deep bush that night. They were waiting right there near the station, tucked into the shadows of the water tanks and the supply crates. They knew a fresh delivery had just arrived. They were barely 30 yards away from the tracks when the air changed. You know that feeling when you're being watched, not just looked at, but scoped? Whitehead felt it. He stopped. He turned his head to scan the thorn bushes. He didn't see anything, but he smelled it. Lions don't smell like house cats. They smell like rotting meat and old dried blood. It's a heavy, musky scent that sticks to the back of your throat. Before he could even pull the hammer back on his rifle, the darkness to his left simply shifted. Imagine this. 1 second, there's nothing but gray thorns. The next, 500 pounds of solid, hairless muscle slams into Whitehead's side. It wasn't a pounce. It was a collision. It felt like being hit by a runaway freight train. Whitehead was thrown into the red dust, his rifle spinning away into the dark. He rolled onto his stomach, trying to scramble away. And that's when he felt the claws, a lion's claw, isn't like a knife. It's like a jagged hook. The lion swiped once, catching Whitehead across the back. It ripped through his thick uniform like it was tissue paper and opened up 4 deep, jagged trenches from his shoulder to his waist. The pain wasn't immediate. The shock was too big for that. But he could feel the sudden, wet warmth of his own blood soaking into his shirt. He was screaming a high, thin sound that didn't sound like a district officer at all. He was pinned to the earth, the weight of the beast pressing the air out of his lungs, the smell of its hot, rancid breath filling his nose. He looked up, and for one heartbeat, he was staring directly into the eyes of the ghost. They weren't animal eyes. They were cold, calculating. But then, something shifted. Maybe Whitehead was too bony. Maybe the lion got confused by the brass buttons on his jacket. Or maybe it just saw something it wanted more. Sergeant Abdullah, brave as hell, had stepped forward to help his boss. He was shouting, trying to distract the monster, and it worked. The lion let out a low, huffing sound, not a roar, just a puff of air, and stepped off Whitehead's back. Whitehead lay there in the dirt, gasping, thinking he was saved. But then he heard the sound. It was a wet, heavy thud, followed by the sound of Abdullah's breath being cut off mid-shout. Whitehead turned his head just enough to see it. The lion had Abdullah by the throat. It didn't shake him like a dog with a toy. It just held him, its massive jaws clamped shut, and started to back away. Abdullah's eyes were wide, looking right at Whitehead, pleading for help that wasn't coming. Whitehead watched, paralyzed by the blood loss and the sheer, raw terror as his sergeant was dragged, feet first, into the whistling thorns. The sound of the man's boots scraping against the dry ground was the last thing Whitehead heard before the silence of the Nika swallowed them both. About an hour later, Patterson was sitting in his tent, trying to map out a new trap when the flap was thrown open. Imagine the sight. District Officer Whitehead stumbles in. His face is the color of ash. His uniform is shredded, hanging off him in bloody ribbons. He's covered in that red Tsavo dust, and his back is a road map of raw meat and white bone. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask for a drink. He just collapsed onto the floor and kept repeating one thing. It took Abdullah. It took him right in front of me. The message was finally brutally clear to everyone in that camp. Up until then, some of the British officers still thought they were untouchable. They thought this was a native problem. But after Whitehead, the man with the medals, the man with the power, stumbled in looking like a piece of chewed-up gristle, the last bit of civilization vanished. The panic didn't just hit an all-time high, it turned into a riot. The workers realized that if the ghost and the darkness could take a district officer at the train station, they could take anyone, anywhere. There were no walls thick enough. There were no titles big enough. To those two demons, you weren't a colonel, you weren't a sergeant, and you weren't a king. You were just meat, and dinner was being served every single night. You hear that wind? Sounds a bit like a train, doesn't it? Let's hope it stays that way. Move a little closer to the light. That wind out there. It's got a bit of a bite to it tonight, doesn't it? It makes the trees creak, and if you listen long enough, you start to think the forest is talking to you. After Whitehead got shredded, the camp shifted from fear to total, mindless desperation. People weren't just scared of the dark anymore. They were scared of the air they breathed. Patterson knew he was losing control. The railroad was a ghost town. The workers were staring at the trains, just waiting for a chance to run. So he came up with a plan. He was an engineer, right? If he couldn't outsmart them or outshoot them, he was going to build them out. Imagine this. Patterson orders every single man left in the camp to start building bomas. Now, don't think of a white picket fence or some neat little garden wall. These were war fortifications. They used the whistling thorn acacia. Let me tell you about those trees. They aren't normal. They have these long white thorns, 3 or 4 inches long, and they are as hard as steel. They're sharp enough to puncture a thick leather boot or even a car tire. The workers cut these trees down and stacked them in massive, dense walls, 10 feet high and 6 feet thick. It was a fortress of needles. It looked like a giant spiked cage surrounding the tents. Inside those walls, for the first time in months, a weird feeling started to spread. It was hope. The workers sat by their fires inside the boma, looking up at those 10-foot walls of thorns. They touched the sharp spikes and nodded. They thought, nothing can get through that, not even a demon. You could feel the tension in the camp drop just a few notches. That night, for the first time, you didn't hear the constant, jagged breathing of 3,000 men staying awake. You heard snoring, deep, heavy sleep. They felt safe. They thought they had finally won a round against the place of slaughter. But the ghost and the darkness, they weren't reading the same script. Here's where it gets weird. A few nights later, the moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. It was pitch black, the kind of dark where you can't see your own hand in front of your face. Inside the main boma, everyone was dead to the world. Suddenly, a scream ripped through the silence. It wasn't outside the fence. It was inside. Imagine the confusion. You wake up, heart hammering, fumbling for a match. You're inside a fortress. You're surrounded by 10 feet of razor-sharp thorns. But you hear the sound of heavy paws hitting the dirt right outside your tent flap. The lions hadn't tried to bash the fence down. They didn't make a bunch of noise. They were smarter than that. They had prowled the perimeter of that massive wall for hours, silent as smoke, until they found a tiny gap, a place where the branches didn't quite overlap. And then they didn't just walk in. They flattened their bodies, tucking those massive muscles tight against their ribs, and they crawled through the thorns like snakes on their bellies, or in some parts of the camp, they just looked at that 10-foot wall and they leapt. They cleared it in one go, landing silently on the other side like a house cat jumping off a sofa, except this cat weighed 500 pounds. In the middle of the camp, a tent collapsed. One of the lions had reached in and snagged a man. But this time, they didn't have an easy exit. They were inside the cage with the meat. And this is the part that'll keep you up at night. The lion didn't panic. It grabbed the man by the shoulder, his screams echoing off the steel rails of the bridge, and it headed for the wall of thorns. But it didn't look for the hole it came in through. It didn't care about the spikes. It dragged the man right into the thickest part of the boma. Imagine the sound. It wasn't just the man screaming. It was the sound of the thorns. Scritch, rip, snap. The lion put its head down and bulldozed its way through those 3-inch needles, dragging the man's body behind it. The thorns were tearing the man's clothes to shreds. They were catching in his skin, ripping lines across his face and chest. The lion didn't even flinch. Those thorns that could puncture tires, They were nothing to the hide of the darkness. It just kept pulling, the sound of breaking wood and tearing fabric filling the night until it burst through the other side of the fence and into the blackness of the Nika. But the lions weren't done being cruel. Usually, a predator takes its kill far away to hide from other hunters. Not these two. They dragged the body maybe 30, 40 yards away from the fence, just far enough that the campfires didn't reach, but close enough that everyone inside the boma could hear every single thing. The men inside the fence stood there, clutching their useless axes and their dim lanterns, staring into the dark. They couldn't see the lions. They couldn't see their friend. All they could hear was the wind and the crunching. That's a sound you never forget. The sound of a large animal chewing through a rib cage. The sound of bones being snapped like dry kindling. The lions were eating him right there, in the open, knowing the men were watching or listening from behind their fortress. Here's the worst part. Patterson realized that the fence hadn't kept the lions out at all. It had just made the men easier to catch. It had locked the fear in. By building those walls, the workers had essentially turned their camp into a giant dinner plate. They were trapped in a cage, listening to the sound of their friends being turned into a meal. And they realized that no wall on earth was going to save them. The hopelessness hit like a physical weight. You could see it in their eyes the next morning. They weren't just tired. They were broken. They looked at the bridge, and they looked at the blood on the thorns, and they knew the ghost and the darkness weren't just animals. They were the masters of Tsavo, and the British were just visitors who had stayed way too long. You hear that? That's just a branch snapping in the fire. Don't worry, the fence here. Well, we don't really have a fence, do we? So, by now, Patterson knows he's not just dealing with a couple of hungry cats. He knows he's in a war, but he still thinks it's a war he can win with a bit of British engineering and a clever plan. He thinks he can outthink them. That was his biggest mistake. Imagine this. The camp has a hospital. Now, don't go picturing a building with white halls and clean sheets. This was 1898. The hospital was just another big canvas tent pitched in the middle of that red dust and those gray thorns. Inside, it didn't smell like pine or fresh air. It smelled like carbolic acid, that sharp, stinging antiseptic smell, mixed with the heavy, sweet scent of malaria, sweat, and the iron tang of blood from the men who'd already been maimed. To you and me, that place sounds like a nightmare, but to the ghost and the darkness, it was a vending machine. Think about it. Inside that tent were the weakest men in the camp, men who couldn't run, men who were too delirious with fever to even know they were being watched. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet that didn't fight back. The lions had started circling it every night, their paws patting softly on the dry earth just outside the canvas. The men inside could hear that low, rhythmic huffing sound, the sound of 500-pound predators deciding which cot to pick first. Patterson saw this, and he thought he had the perfect gotcha moment. This is the chess match. He decided to play a game with the demons. Under the cover of daylight, he moved all the sick and injured men. He had them carried miles away to a new secret location. He didn't tell anyone who didn't need to know. He moved the cots, the medicine, and the smell of sickness to a fresh tent. Then He went back to the old, empty hospital tent. He set it up to look like it was still full. He put some bait out, maybe some old clothes or some scrap meat, and he sat there. He stayed in a dark corner of that tent, his rifle across his knees, his finger resting on the trigger. He sat in the silence for hours, breathing in the fading scent of antiseptic. He thought, when they come back for their easy meal tonight, I'm going to be the one waiting. I'm going to end this. He sat through the sunset. He sat through the midnight hours. He sat until his eyes burned and his back ached. Silence. Not a twig snapped. Not a shadow moved. The old hospital tent was as quiet as a tomb. Patterson started to feel a bit smug. He figured he'd scared them off, or maybe they were finally getting cautious. But then the sun started to peek over the horizon, and a messenger came running from the new location, the safe spot miles away. The man was shaking so hard he could barely speak. His clothes were torn, and his eyes were wide with a kind of shock that you can't fake. And that's when Patterson realized the truth. Here's where it gets weird. The lions never showed up at the old tent. They didn't even sniff around the trap. Somehow, and nobody can explain how, they knew. They didn't go to the place that smelled like blood for months. They ignored the obvious target. Instead, they had trekked through the dark, bypassed the main camp, and walked straight to the new secret hospital location. It was a total checkmate. Imagine this. You're one of those sick men. You're lying on a cot, shivering with fever, thinking you're finally safe because the colonel moved you away from the place of slaughter. It's quiet. There are no guards because everyone thought the lions would be busy at the old tent. Then you hear it. Rap. The sound of heavy canvas tearing like it was made of paper. The cool night air rushes in, but it brings that smell with it. The smell of rotting meat and predator musk. You're too weak to move. You can't even roll out of your cot. All you can do is lie there in the dark as the screaming starts. It wasn't a hunt. It was a slaughter. The lions didn't just take one man and leave. They tore through that tent like they were possessed. They were jumping from cot to cot. The men who were too sick to walk were trying to crawl under their beds. Can you imagine the helplessness? To be trapped in your own body by fever, watching a hairless, 500-pound demon decide if it wants to eat you or the guy next to you. The chaos was absolute. The lions were ripping into the invalids, the sound of tearing flesh and breaking wood filling the tent. There was no one to stop them, no one to fire a gun. By the time the sun came up, the safe hospital was a charnel house. When Patterson finally arrived at the scene, he didn't see animals. He saw the aftermath of a calculated strike. He stood in the middle of that ruined tent, looking at the blood on the medicine bottles and the shredded cots, and he felt a coldness in his gut that had nothing to do with the morning air. That was the moment the realization hit everyone. Not just the superstitious workers, but the officers too. It wasn't just an animal. Animals act on instinct. They go to the places they know. They follow their noses. But these things, they were thinking. They were solving problems. They understood that Patterson was trying to trick them, and they had punished him for it. They had looked at his trap and laughed, then went and killed the very people he was trying to protect. They were winning, not just the physical war, but the mental one. They were breaking the spirit of every man in Tsavo. The workers started saying the lions could read minds. They said the ghost and the darkness were listening to their conversations in the wind, and honestly, looking at the empty, blood-stained cots in a place that should have been a secret. Patterson was starting to believe it too. He sat in the dark all night for nothing, while his men were being torn apart miles away. The iron snake had completely stopped. The workers weren't even looking at the bridge anymore. They were looking at the trains. They were looking for any way out of this hell, because they realized the truth. If the lions could find you in a secret hospital in the middle of the night, they could find you anywhere. The demons were in charge now. Check the fire again, will you? Those logs are burning down to glowing ribs, and the darkness is starting to press in a little closer. After the Hospital Massacre, the camp wasn't a camp anymore. It was a pressure cooker about to blow. The workers were done. They were literally hijacking trains, clinging to the roofs and the cowcatchers just to get away from Tsavo. But Patterson, he was still there. He couldn't leave. He had a bridge to build, and he had a reputation to save. But he finally realized he couldn't do it alone. He brought in 3 of the best shots he could find, men who weren't afraid of a little shadow. And he came up with a plan that, on paper, was absolutely foolproof. Imagine this. Patterson takes a heavy railway carriage, a big, thick-walled metal box on wheels. He divides it right down the middle with a wall of massive iron bars. On one side of the bars, he puts 3 heavily armed hunters. They've got their rifles, plenty of ammo, and a clear view of the other half. On the other side of the bars, he puts the bait. He leads a donkey into the empty half of the car and leaves the door wide open. The idea was simple, almost beautiful in its logic. The lion smells the donkey, walks into the metal box, trips a wire, and clang! A heavy iron door drops down. The lion is trapped in a cage, and the hunters, safe behind their bars, just have to point and pull the trigger. It was a kill box. There was no way to lose. Here's where it gets weird. The night they set the trap, the air was thick, not just with heat, but with that greasy, metallic smell of rust and old grease from the railway. The 3 men climbed into their half of the carriage and sat on the floor. Try to put yourself in that box with them. It's pitch black. You're sitting in a metal container in the middle of a graveyard. The only sound is the donkey on the other side of the bars, shifting its hooves and breathing in heavy, nervous puffs. The donkey knows. It can smell the death in the wind. The hunters were sweating through their uniforms. Every time the metal carriage creaked as it cooled down from the sun, they nearly jumped out of their skins. They were sitting in a tomb of their own making, waiting for a monster to join them. Hours went by. The silence was so loud it made their ears ring. Then the donkey stopped moving. It didn't bray. It didn't kick. It just froze. One of the hunters whispered, "Did you hear that?" But there was nothing to hear. That was the problem. The place of slaughter had gone dead quiet. Suddenly, a massive shape glided through the open door. It didn't walk. It flowed like a spill of ink across the floor. It was the ghost. The donkey backed into the corner, trembling so hard the whole carriage began to vibrate. The lion didn't even look at the hunters behind the bars. It was focused on the meat. It stepped deeper into the car, its massive paws silent on the metal floor. Snap! The tripwire gave way. Clang! The iron door didn't just fall. It slammed home with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. The echoes bounced off the metal walls, deafeningly loud. The trap worked. They had him. The demon was in the cage, but this is the moment where the ingenious plan turned into a nightmare. You'd think the hunters would just start shooting, right? That's what they were there for. But you have to understand what it feels like to be trapped in a metal box with 500 pounds of hairless man-eating fury. The lion didn't curl up and die. It went absolutely berserk. Imagine the panic. The lion realized it was trapped, and it exploded. It started throwing its entire weight against the iron bars, the very bars, separating it from the men. The whole railway carriage started rocking back and forth on the tracks. The sound of its claws screeching against the metal was like 1,000 fingernails on a chalkboard, only louder. The hunters lost their minds. The professional best shots became terrified kids. They started firing their rifles wildly into the dark. Now, think about this. You are in a small metal box. You are firing high-powered rifles. Every time a gun goes off, the flash blinds you for a second, and the noise, God, the noise. In that enclosed space, the muzzle blasts were like grenades going off next to your ears. They couldn't see what they were shooting at. They were just pointing into the dark and screaming, the smell of gunpowder smoke filling the air until they were choking on it. Bullets were whistling everywhere. They were ricocheting off the metal walls, zinging past the hunters' heads. It was a miracle they didn't kill each other. And the lion? The lion was a whirlwind of teeth and claws. It was throwing itself at the door, then the bars, then the walls. It was a blur of yellow eyes and snarling muscle. And then the impossible happened. One of the wild shots, nobody knows, whose hit the locking mechanism on the heavy iron door. Or, as some of the men swore later, the lion actually grabbed the bars and bent the steel with brute force. Either way, in the middle of the gun smoke and the screaming, there was a heavy thud. The door creaked open. The lion didn't hesitate. It squeezed through the opening, hit the ground running, and vanished into the thicket like he'd never been there at all. When the smoke finally cleared and the ringing in their ears subsided, Patterson ran up to the carriage. He threw open the side door and looked in. The 3 hunters were huddled in the corner, shaking. One of them, a guy who had hunted big game his whole life, had actually fainted dead away. The donkey was miraculously untouched, just standing there in a state of total shock. But the lion was gone. They had him in a box. They had 3 rifles and enough ammo to start a small war. They were inches away from the beast, and they missed every single shot. Not a drop of blood was found on the floor. That was the night the last bit of hope died in. Tsavo! The men started whispering that the lions had divine protection. They said the bullets didn't miss. They said the bullets passed right through the ghost because he wasn't made of flesh and bone. Patterson stood there looking at the bent steel and the empty cage, and he realized that the iron snake wasn't just stalled. It was being mocked. The lions weren't just eating the workers. They were playing with the hunters. The trap hadn't failed because of bad engineering. It had failed because you can't cage a nightmare. And now the ghost and the darkness knew that even the metal boxes weren't safe. Anyway, who's got the next watch? I'm joking, mostly. The fire is starting to die down, and that's when the shadows really start to play tricks on you. You see that bit of movement over by the big acacia tree? Probably just the wind. But in Tsavo in 1898, you wouldn't be so sure. After the railway carriage trap failed, after the ghost walked right through a cage of iron and lead without a scratch, the spirit of the camp didn't just break, it curdled. Imagine this. You haven't slept a full night in 4 months. Every time you close your eyes, you hear the sound of canvas ripping. Every time the wind whistles through the thorns, you think it's the huffing breath of a man-eater. The workers were ghosts themselves, gray with dust, eyes bloodshot and sunken, hands shaking so hard they couldn't even hold a hammer. When human beings are that scared for that long, the part of the brain that does math and logic just shuts off. Paranoia takes over, and paranoia needs a target. They couldn't catch the lions. They couldn't kill the lions. So they looked for someone they could hurt. They looked at Colonel Patterson. Here's where it gets weird. Fear does this thing where it twists the truth until it looks like a nightmare. The workers started whispering by their small, flickering fires. They remembered that before Patterson arrived, the lions were just a legend, a story to scare kids. But since he stepped off that train, people were dying every single night. They watched him set his ingenious traps, and they watched the lions walk away laughing. They saw him fire his modern rifle and miss at point-blank range. To a rational mind, that's just bad luck or a smart predator. But to a man who just watched his best friend get eaten 30 yards away, it's something else. The rumor started in the back of the camp and spread like a fever. Patterson was cursed, or worse. Some of the men started saying he wasn't trying to kill the lions at all. They whispered that he was the White Devil, a sorcerer who had brought these demons with him to punish the workers. They believed he was talking to the lions in the dark, telling them which tent to hit next. It sounds crazy to us sitting here, right? But you put yourself in a tent in the place of slaughter, and suddenly the guy in charge starts looking a lot like the enemy. The jamadars, the head workers, the big, tough guys who ran the crews, started holding secret meetings. No lanterns, just hushed voices in the dark, muffled by the sound of the wind. They decided that the Iron Snake was never going to be finished as long as Patterson was breathing. They figured that if they killed the man who brought the curse, the spirits of the ancient king would be satisfied and the lions would finally go back into the bush. They weren't planning a protest. They were planning a murder. One afternoon, the heat was particularly brutal. It was that thick, heavy heat that makes the air feel like it's vibrating. Patterson walked out of his tent to check on a section of the bridge. He noticed it immediately, the silence. Usually the camp was a wall of noise, hammering, shouting, the hiss of steam. But that day it was dead quiet. Thousands of men were just standing there, leaning on their shovels, watching him. Imagine this. You're Patterson. You walk into a clearing and a group of 30 jamadars, big, muscular men who have spent their lives doing back-breaking labor, slowly form a circle around you. They don't say a word. They just stare. Patterson looked into their eyes and didn't see the men he'd worked with for months. He saw a wall of pure, unadulterated hatred. He saw the glint of sunlight on the long, curved knives they used for clearing brush. He saw a man reaching for a heavy iron crowbar. He realized in that second that he wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the prey. And he wasn't being hunted by the ghost, or the darkness. He was being hunted by the very people he was trying to protect. The circles started to tighten. One of the jamadars stepped forward, his face twisted in a snarl, screaming something about the white devil and the blood of the workers. This was the moment, the breaking point. Patterson knew that if he showed even a flicker of fear, he was dead. If he turned to run, they'd be on him in seconds, and they'd tear him apart right there in the red dust. So he did the only thing a man like him could do. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't plead for his life. He stepped toward the leader. He closed the gap before the man could swing his knife. Patterson was a soldier, remember? He used his fists. He put his entire weight into a punch that sent the lead, Jamadar sprawling back into the dirt. Before the others could react, Patterson reached into his coat and whipped out his heavy service revolver. He didn't point it at the sky. He pointed it right at the next man's chest. "The next person who moves," he growled, his voice steady even though his heart was probably screaming, "dies right here." The standoff felt like it lasted a lifetime. You could hear the dust blowing against the metal rails. You could see the sweat dripping off the workers' chins. It was a battle of wills. One man with a gun against 100. Men with hate in their hearts. Slowly, one by one, the workers lowered their knives. They didn't stop hating him, but the immediate fire of the mutiny died down. They slunk back to their tents, muttering threats under their breath, leaving Patterson standing alone in the middle of the clearing. He'd survived, but as he walked back to his tent, his back burning with the feeling of 1,000 eyes watching him, the reality of his situation finally hit him. He was trapped. He couldn't trust the guards. He couldn't trust his foreman. He couldn't even trust the shadows in his own tent. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts now. Out there in the gray thorns were 2 500-pound demons that wanted to eat his flesh. And in here, inside the safety of the camp, were 3,000 men who wanted to slit his throat and dump his body in the river. He was the colonel of a ghost camp, the engineer of a bridge to nowhere, and the target of every living thing in Tsavo. He was completely, utterly alone. And the sun, well, the sun was starting to go down again. You hear that rustle? Probably just a squirrel. But if I were you, I'd keep my back to the fire. Check the fire again, will you? Those embers are looking a bit like eyes, watching us from the ash. We've talked about the blood, the traps that failed, and the way the camp turned on itself. But there comes a point in every horror story where the victims realize that no one is coming to save them. For the workers at Tsavo, that day was December 1st, 1898. Imagine this. It's been 9 months of hell, 9 months of watching your friends get dragged into the thorns, 9 months of the ghost and the darkness mocking every wall you build and every bullet you fire. The workers, men who had traveled thousands of miles for a paycheck, suddenly realized that no amount of money is worth being eaten alive. They didn't care about the British Empire. They didn't care about their contracts. They just wanted to see another sunrise. On that December morning, the heat was already rising off the red dust, but the camp was different. Usually, there was the sound of hammers and the shouting of foremen. Not that day. That day, there was only the sound of thousands of men moving toward the tracks. It wasn't an orderly departure. It was a swarm. Imagine the scene at the train station. It looked like a city fleeing an invading army. When the supply train pulled in, the men didn't wait for it to stop. They surged forward like a wave. They weren't looking for seats or tickets. They were climbing onto the roofs of the cars. They were hanging off the sides, their fingers white as they gripped the window frames. They were sitting on the couplings between the carriages, dangerously close to the wheels. Some were even clinging to the cowcatcher at the very front of the engine. They looked like refugees. They were covered in that red Tsavo dust, clutching their only belongings in small bundles, their eyes darting toward the tree line with every hiss of the steam engine. They were terrified that even now, in broad daylight, the demons would leap out and pull them off the moving train. Patterson stood on the platform, watching his entire workforce vanish. He tried to stop them. He shouted, he waved his arms, he talked about duty and the bridge, but they didn't even look at him. To them, Patterson was just another part of the curse. The train hissed. The whistle screamed, a sound that usually meant progress. But this time, it was the sound of a total surrender. As the train pulled away, it was so overloaded that the engine groaned under the weight. Thousands of men piled on top of each other, literally fleeing for their lives. And then the silence started. Here's where it gets weird. You ever been in a place that's supposed to be loud but isn't? Like a stadium after everyone leaves, or a school in the middle of the night? It's not a normal silence. It's heavy. As the sound of the train faded into the distance, the smoke clearing from the tracks, Patterson was left standing in the middle of a ghost town. Just a few hours ago, this was a camp of 3,000 men. There were fires burning, people coughing, the sound of the river, the clanging of steel. Now, nothing. He walked back through the camp. Imagine this. Tents were left wide open, flapping in the hot wind. Half-eaten bowls of rice were sitting on crates, the flies already buzzing over them. Tools, expensive hammers, saws, and shovels were just dropped in the dirt where the men stood. It was like everyone had simply vanished into thin air. The wind whistled through the bomas, those 10-foot walls of thorns we talked about. But now, there was no one inside them to protect. The fires were smoldering down to white ash. The iron snake, that grand project of the most powerful empire on earth, was just a line of cold, dead metal stretching into a silent wilderness. Patterson went to his office and did the only thing he could do. He sat down and wrote a telegram to the House of Parliament in London. Can you imagine being the guy in London who received that? You're sitting in a rainy office, surrounded by maps of the world, feeling like the masters of the globe. And you get a piece of paper that says, "Work completely stopped. Lions halting advance." Let that sink in. 2 lions. No mayonnaise, no supernatural powers on paper. Just 2 animals had brought the British Empire to a grinding, humiliating halt. They had defeated the engineers, the soldiers, and the steam engines. They had won. But for Patterson, the nightmare was just entering its final act. See, he wasn't alone. He had a handful of men left, mostly other officers, and a few brave souls who were either too loyal or too stubborn to run. But the dynamic had changed. Before, the Lions had 3,000 targets to choose from. It was a vending machine, remember? They could pick a different tent every night. They didn't have to work hard. But now, the buffet was closed. The thousands of targets were gone. Patterson stood in the center of that empty camp. the sun setting behind the gray thorns, and he realized he was no longer a project manager. He wasn't a colonel. He was a gladiator standing in a massive, empty arena. He looked at the empty tents, the silence ringing in his ears, and he knew what was coming. The ghost and the darkness were still out there. They hadn't left with the train. They were still in the bushes, watching the smoke clear, realized that their food had vanished, and they were going to be very, very hungry. From now on, the lions wouldn't be looking for a coolie in a crowded tent. They'd be looking for the only heartbeats left in the valley. They'd be coming specifically for him. The war wasn't over. It had just become personal. You hear that? That's just the wind hitting the side of the tent. It's a lonely sound, isn't it? Makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. Anyway, let's get some more wood on this fire. I don't like how quiet it's getting. The thousands of workers are gone. The camp is a skeleton. The iron snake is just a long, rusted needle sticking into the heart of a silent land. Patterson is alone with a handful of men, and he knows that the games are over. He's stopped trying to build cages. He's stopped trying to outthink them with blueprints. Now it's just him, a rifle, and a piece of meat. Imagine this. It's December 9th. Patterson finds a tree near the river, a big, gnarled thing with branches that look like reaching fingers. He builds a machan, nothing more than a few planks of wood tied together with rope, perched about 12 feet off the ground. It's flimsy, it's cramped, and every time the wind blows, the wood groans. He ties a dead donkey to a stake at the foot of the tree. That's the bait. He climbs up, pulls his heavy .303 rifle onto his lap, and he waits. With 3,000 men gone, the silence in Tsavo was heavy enough to crush you. No hammers, no shouting, just the sound of your own lungs expanding and contracting. Patterson sat there for hours. The sun went down, bleeding into the red dust, and the sky turned that deep ink-black color. You ever sat so still that you could hear your own heartbeat in your ears? Thump, 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 thump. That was Patterson's world. He's drenched in sweat, but his skin feels cold. He's got mosquitoes biting his neck, but he doesn't move. He can't, because he knows it wasn't just an animal out there. It was a witness. Hours pass. Midnight comes and goes. The moon is a thin, pale sliver, barely giving enough light to see the white belly of the dead donkey. Then the air changed. Lions are supposed to be loud, right? They're supposed to roar and announce their presence. But the ghost didn't do that. 1 second, the donkey was alone in the clearing. The next, a shadow was just there. Here's where it gets weird. There was no sound of a footstep, no snapping of a twig. The ghost just materialized out of the dark, like he'd been woven from the night air. He was massive, bigger than he'd looked in the camp. He stood over the donkey, his maneless head low, sniffing the air. Patterson felt the adrenaline hit him like an electric shock. His hands started to shake, and for a second, he thought he was going to drop the rifle. He squeezed his eyes shut for a heartbeat, forced his breath to slow down, and then he raised the barrel. He looked through the sights. All he could see was a dark mass against the pale dust. He aimed for the shoulder. He took a breath, held it, and pulled the trigger. Boom! The sound was like a cannon going off in a cathedral. The muzzle flash was a blinding, white-hot explosion that burned his retinas. For 3 seconds, Patterson was totally blind, his ears ringing with a high-pitched scream. He didn't hear a death groan. He heard a roar, but it wasn't the roar you hear in movies. It was a sound of pure, unbridled rage and pain. It was a vibration that shook the very tree he was sitting in. He heard the lion thrashing in the bushes, the sound of heavy bodies slamming against the thorns, the sound of teeth snapping at the air or at its own wound. Patterson scrambled to reload, his fingers fumbling with the cold brass of the cartridges. But by the time he had another round chambered, the thrashing had stopped. Silence returned to Tsavo, but it was a different silence. It was a waiting silence. Imagine this. You're Patterson. You're 12 feet up in a tree. It's 2 a.m. You know you hit him. You heard the impact. But is he dead? Or is he lying at the bottom of your ladder, his belly open, waiting for you to climb down so he can take you with him? He spent the rest of the night shivering on that platform. Every time the wind rustled a leaf, he pointed his rifle at the ground. He didn't sleep. He didn't even blink. He sat there, staring into the black, until the sky finally started to turn a dusty gray. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, Patterson called out to his scouts. They came cautiously, rifles leveled, their eyes wide. They tracked the blood, bright, frothy red on the gray thorns. They found him about 50 yards away. The ghost was dead. He was stretched out in the red dust, his mouth open, showing teeth that were the size of a man's fingers. Patterson climbed down and walked over to the body. He stopped. He'd hunted all over the world, but he'd never seen anything like this. This wasn't a stray cat. Imagine the size of this thing. They pulled out a tape measure from the tip of his nose to the end of his tail. The ghost measured 9 feet, 8 inches. He was all muscle, sleek, scarred, and terrifyingly powerful. His paws were the size of dinner plates. It took 8 grown men, grunting and sweating, to heave that body onto a pole to carry it back to camp. When they walked into the clearing, the few workers who were left went wild. They started dancing. They started cheering. They were shouting, "The demon is dead! The curse is lifted!" They thought the nightmare was over. They thought they could go back to building their bridge and living their lives. Patterson watched them celebrate. He looked at the dead lion, looking almost peaceful now that the life was gone from its eyes. But then he turned around. He looked back toward the river. He looked at the endless gray, twisted miles of the Nika. He didn't join in the cheering because he remembered the tracks. He remembered the nights in the hospital tent. He remembered the trap in the railway car. There were always 2. The ghost was dead. The white devil had won a round. But as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of the dead lion into the bush, Patterson knew the darkness was still out there. And now the darkness was alone. It didn't have a partner to distract the guards. It didn't have a brother to help it drag the kills. And a predator with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing in the world. Patterson gripped his rifle a little tighter. The celebration was loud, but all he could hear was the silence waiting for him in the trees. He knew the hunt wasn't over. It had just become a vendetta. But that's the thing about a nightmare. Just when you think you've woken up, you realize you're still in the dark. Imagine this. The night after they killed the first lion, the camp was still. The few workers left were huddled in their tents, feeling that first thin sliver of hope. But then the wind shifted, and a sound started coming out of the Nika. The gray, twisted thorns. It wasn't a roar like you hear in the movies. It wasn't that deep, vibrating rumble of a king protecting his pride. This was something different. It was a high, thin, keening sound. A wail. It was the second lion, the darkness, calling out for his brother. He didn't leave. He didn't run away now that his partner was gone. For 3 straight nights, that lion circled the perimeter of the empty camp. Every time the fires dipped, he'd let out that haunting scream. He was looking for the ghost. He was looking for the one who had hunted with him for years. And when he didn't find him, that roar changed. It stopped being a call and started being a threat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated loss. And let me tell you, a predator that's lost everything is a lot scarier than one that's just hungry. Here's where it gets weird. Before this, the 2 lions had been a tactical team. They were smart, they were quiet, and they hid in the shadows. But after the ghost died, the darkness changed. He stopped playing by the rules. He stopped hiding. Patterson started noticing it during the day. Imagine this. You're out by the half-finished bridge, the sun beating down on the red dust, making everything shimmer. You look over at the edge of the clearing just 100 yards away, and there he is. The darkness was just standing there, out in the open, in the middle of the afternoon. He wasn't crouched. He wasn't stalking. He was just staring. Those yellow, unblinking eyes were fixed right on Patterson. It didn't matter where Patterson went, if he was checking the rails or talking to the few scouts he had left. He'd look up, and the lion would be there, a silent, hairless shadow that seemed to follow him like a curse. The psychological toll on Patterson was brutal. He stopped being the hunter. He realized, with a cold knot in his stomach, that he was the one being tracked. This wasn't about food anymore. The lion seemed to know who had pulled the trigger on his brother. It was like a vendetta. Patterson couldn't eat. He couldn't think. Every time he walked through the bush, he felt those eyes on the back of his neck. The paranoia was so thick you could taste it, like the metallic tang of old blood. He started sleeping, with his heavy service revolver gripped in his hand, his finger actually resting on the trigger. He was jumping at the sound of a leaf hitting the ground. He was a soldier, a man's man, and he was being dismantled by a cat. The few workers left saw it too. They stopped cheering. The whispers started again, lower this time, more desperate. They said the first lion was just a beast. But this one was the Shaitani itself, the evil spirit. They said it couldn't be killed by bullets because it wasn't made of meat and bone anymore. It was made of spite. Patterson tried to end it. He couldn't take the staring anymore. One evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, he saw the lion sitting on a small rock mound. It was the perfect shot. Patterson took a deep breath, steadied his rifle against a tree trunk, and squeezed the trigger. Click. Nothing. A misfire. A 1 in a million dud round. Patterson scrambled to clear the chamber, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slammed a new shell in, leveled the rifle again, and fired. Boom! The recoil kicked his shoulder back, and the muzzle flash blinded him for a second. But when the smoke cleared, there was nothing. No body, no blood. The lion hadn't even run. It had just vanished into the gray thorns like it had never been there. It felt like he was shooting at a ghost. Imagine the feeling of standing there in the fading light, holding a modern high-powered rifle and realizing it doesn't mean a thing. Patterson stood there in the red dust, and for the first time, he felt a wave of total, absolute hopelessness. He realized he was out of luck. He had used up all his hero moments on the first lion. He walked back to his tent that night, his feet feeling like lead. He knew he couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep waiting for the lion to decide when it was time for him to die. The darkness was getting closer every single night. The tracks in the dust the next morning were always a few feet closer to Patterson's door. It was a countdown. He sat on his cot, the smell of the kerosene lamp filling the small space, and he came to a realization. If he stayed in his tent, he was dead. If he stayed in the camp, he was dead. The iron snake was dead. He had to do something insane. He had to give the lion exactly what it wanted. He decided right then and there, no more boxes, no more metal carriages, no more hiding behind iron bars. If this lion wanted a face-off, he was going to give it one. He was going to go back into the trees, back into the place of slaughter, and he was going to stand his ground where there was nothing between him and the demon but 30 yards of empty air. He looked at his rifle, then at the revolver in his belt. He knew this was the end of the story one way or another. Either he was going home or he was going to become another collection of bones in a cave that no one would ever find. "All right," he whispered to the dark. "You want me? Come and get me." Outside, in the deep blackness of the Nika, a low huffing sound answered him. The darkness was ready. "Move a bit closer. I'm serious. Get right up against the heat of these logs. The fire is doing that low blue flicker, and the shadows behind us are getting long. This is it." December 29th, 1898. The night, the place of slaughter, finally had to decide who was the master, the man or the demon. After weeks of being hunted, after watching the ghost die and realizing the darkness was now playing a game of pure revenge, Patterson was a different man. He wasn't the arrogant British officer who stepped off the train months ago. He was thin, his eyes were sunken, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd spent so many nights awake that the line between being awake and dreaming had started to blur. Imagine this. It's pitch black. I mean the kind of black where the air feels thick, like you're underwater. Patterson is back in a tree, perched on another one of those flimsy wooden platforms. He's got a dead donkey tied to a stake below him, but he isn't even looking at it. He knows better now. He's staring into the gaps between the thorn bushes, his finger resting on the cold steel of his rifle's trigger. The jungle was deafeningly quiet. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of his own heavy, ragged breathing. He could hear the blood thumping in his ears. Thump, 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 like a drum counting down the seconds. Then he felt it, not a sound, but a vibration, a shift in the air. He looked down, past his boots, past the edge of the wooden planks. He didn't see the lion at the donkey. Here's where it gets weird. The darkness didn't care about the bait. He didn't care about a free meal. Patterson looked straight down, and there, in the absolute black, he saw two glowing emerald green eyes. They weren't looking at the donkey. They were staring straight up at him. The lion had spent the last hour circling the tree. It hadn't made a single sound. It had been watching Patterson watch the bushes. It knew exactly where the threat was. It wasn't hunting for food anymore. It was hunting for the man who killed its brother. Imagine this. You're 12 feet up in the air. You think you're safe. You've been told your whole life that lions don't climb trees. They're too heavy, too clumsy. But it wasn't just an animal down there. Patterson heard a new sound. Scritch, scritch, crack. The tree began to vibrate. It wasn't the wind. He looked over the edge, and his heart nearly stopped. The darkness was coming up. He could hear the massive claws, 4 inches of curved bone, digging deep into the bark. He could hear the lion's breath, a low, rhythmic growl that sounded like a boiler about to explode. The branches groaned under the weight of 500 pounds of muscle. The lion was feet away. Patterson could smell it now, that rancid metallic stench of old blood and rot. He could see the outline of the bald, scarred head rising over the edge of the platform. He didn't panic. He couldn't afford to. He leveled his heavy .303 rifle, the barrel trembling just an inch. He aimed right between those glowing green eyes. He took a shallow breath, squeezed his eyes half shut against the coming flash, and pulled the trigger. Click! The sound was small, tiny, but in that silence, it sounded like a mountain snapping in half. The gun had jammed. A dud round. The firing pin had hit the primer, and nothing. No bang, no flash, just the hollow metallic sound of a failure. Imagine the panic. You are holding a useless piece of iron. The demon is so close you can see the whiskers on its snout. It's pulling itself onto the last branch, its muscles tensing for the final leap that will end your life. Patterson's heart wasn't just pounding. It was trying to burst out of his chest. His hands were slick with sweat, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He didn't have time to clear the jam. He dropped the rifle. It clattered against the branches and scrambled for the second gun. He had leaned against the trunk. His fingers fumbled. He felt the wood of the stock. He swung it around, not even bothering to look through the sights. The lion was mid-crouch, its haunches quivering, ready to launch itself into the platform and tear his throat out. Bang! The muzzle flash lit up the tree like a lightning strike. The recoil slammed Patterson's shoulder back against the trunk, nearly knocking him off the platform. But the bullet found its mark. He'd fired blind, and the slug hit the lion square in the chest. The darkness let out a roar that probably woke up every living thing for 10 miles. It wasn't a roar of dominance. It was a scream of agony and shock. The force of the shot threw the beast backward. It lost its grip on the bark, its claws screaming as they raked uselessly against the wood, and it fell. Thud! The lion hit the red dust below with a sound like a sack of stones. Patterson sat there, gasping for air, the smell of gunpowder stinging his eyes. He expected silence. He expected it to be over. But then he heard the scratching again. He looked down. The darkness was back on its feet. It was coughing blood, its chest a ruin. But it was still trying to get back to the tree. It was dragging its hind legs, its eyes still locked on Patterson, its mouth open in a silent, bloody snarl. It wouldn't stop. It couldn't stop. It was like the spite inside. It was the only thing keeping the heart beating. Patterson didn't wait. He didn't give it a chance to breathe. He stood up on that shaky platform and began a barrage. Bang! Bang, bang. He fired again and again. Every time a bullet hit, the lion's body would jerk, but it kept trying to crawl. It was like shooting a ghost. It just wouldn't stay down. He emptied the magazine. Finally, after the 9th bullet tore through its lungs, the massive head of the darkness hit the dirt one last time. A long, shuddering breath escaped its throat, the last bit of life leaving the place of slaughter. Then the silence came back. It wasn't the heavy, scary silence from before. It was a real silence, the kind that happens when a fever finally breaks. Patterson sat in that tree until the sun came up, his revolver still clutched in his hand, his eyes never leaving the shape in the dust. When the light finally hit the ground, he climbed down. He was so weak, his legs buckled when he hit the dirt. He walked over to the lion. It was even bigger than the first one. It was a titan. It took 9 heavy caliber bullets to bring that thing down. 9. Patterson looked at the bridge, then at the 2 dead kings of Tsavo, and he realized it was finally over. The Iron Snake could move again. The Lunatic Express could keep screaming across the plains. But the land would never be the same. He stood there in the red dust, the sun warming his face for the first time in months, and he realized he'd survived the impossible. The ghost and the darkness were gone. But if you go to Tsavo today and you stand by that river when the sun is going down, they say you can still feel the weight in the air. You can still hear that low, huffing breath in the thorns. Because some things don't just die when the heart stops beating. Some things stay in the dirt forever. Anyway, that's the story. The fire's pretty much dead now. I think it's time we all headed to our tents. Just maybe keep a flashlight handy. You know, just in case. It was a graveyard. It was a charnel house. It was a map of every person who had gone missing in that valley for years, long before the British ever thought of building a railroad. But then the torchlight caught something else, something that shouldn't have been there. Here's where it gets weird. As Patterson moved the light over the piles of bone, he saw glints of color. Metal. He knelt down, his hand shaking, and picked something up from the dust. It was a copper bangle, the kind the local tribes wore. He found a gold ring. He found small, decorative beads and pieces of jewelry that had once belonged to the workers or the travelers passing through the valley. Now, think about that. A lion can't eat copper. A lion doesn't care about gold. Normally, an animal would leave those things behind at the site of the kill. But these two, they had brought the jewelry back. They had kept it. They weren't just eating people. They were collecting us. Patterson stood in that trophy room and realized that the ghost and the darkness had been more than just man-eaters. They were a dynasty. They had been the kings of this valley for a generation, and the cave was their treasury. It was proof that they didn't just hunt out of hunger. They hunted because they liked the game. They liked the way we tasted, and they liked the things we carried. Eventually, Patterson left Africa. He took the skins of the 2 lions with him. For years, they were rugs in his house. Imagine walking across those demons every morning to get your coffee. But in 1924, he sold them to the Field Museum in Chicago. Imagine this. If you go to Chicago today, you can walk into that museum and see them. They aren't rugs anymore. They've been stuffed and mounted. They're standing behind glass in a big climate-controlled hall. But when you look at them, you'll notice something. They look small. They look like stiff, dusty cats. They don't have the manes, and they don't look like the 9-foot monsters from the stories. They look safe. But here's the thing. People who work at the museum, the night guards, the cleaners, they don't like being in that hall alone. They say that even though the lions are behind glass, they still feel like they're being watched. They say that if you stand there long enough in the silence, you can still feel that heavy, vibrating dread that Patterson felt in his tree. The locals back in Tsavo, they just laugh at the museum. They say you can't trap a shaitani in a glass box. They believe the spirits of the ghost and the darkness never left the place of slaughter. They say the lions are still out there, woven into the shadows of the gray thorns, just waiting for the next iron snake to try and cross their path. The railroad is still there. The bridge is still standing. We think we won. We think we tamed the wild. But looking at those jewelry pieces in the dirt of that cave, you have to wonder. We built the railroad. We killed the lions. But looking at those bones in the cave, you have to wonder, who really won? Anyway, the fire's out. I think I heard something moving near the tents. Probably just a deer. Probably. Sleep well. The fire is almost out. Just a few glowing ribs of wood left, and the wind. It's started to pick up, hasn't it? It sounds like it's whistling through those thorns we talked about. The story should have ended when the second lion hit the dirt. That's how the movies do it. The hero stands over the beast. The sun rises, and the credits roll. And for a while, that's exactly what it felt like in Tsavo. Imagine the relief. The day after the darkness fell, the silence in the camp changed. It wasn't that heavy, suffocating silence anymore. It was light. The few workers who stayed started singing. Within a week, the word had spread down the line to the coast and up into the highlands. The demons were dead. The trains started coming back. Thousands of men poured off the carriages, looking at Patterson like he was a god. They picked up their hammers, they lit their fires, and the iron snake began to crawl forward again. The bridge over the Tsavo River, the project that had cost 135 lives, was finally finished. Patterson stood on those steel rails and watched the first steam engine scream across the water. He had done it. He'd beaten the place of slaughter. But the story doesn't end with a bridge. See, Patterson was a hunter, and a hunter needs to know his prey. Even with the bodies of the ghost and the darkness being skinned and prepared as trophies, he couldn't stop thinking about where they had come from. He wanted to find their home. He took a few of his bravest scouts and followed the old dried-up trails. They tracked the ghosts of the lions back through the gray, twisted thorns, deeper into the Nika than any of the workers had ever dared to go. They followed the path of least resistance, looking for the places where the bushes had been matted down by heavy, dragging weight. They found it near a rocky outcrop by the river, a cave. Imagine this. You're standing at the mouth of a dark hole in the earth. The heat is thick, and the air around the entrance doesn't smell like the bush. It smells sweet, that cloying, sugary smell of old rotting meat and ancient dust. Patterson lit a torch and stepped inside. It wasn't just a sleeping spot. You'd expect a lion's den to have some matted grass. maybe a few stray feathers or a deer bone. But as the light of the torch hit the floor, Patterson's breath hitched in his throat. The floor wasn't dirt. It was white. Imagine the disgust. Every time Patterson took a step, he heard a sound like dry sticks snapping, crunch, crack. He looked down, and he realized he was standing on a carpet of human remains. It wasn't just a few victims from the railroad. There were hundreds of bones. There were skulls, some old and yellowed, some fresh and white, staring up from the shadows. There were femurs, ribs, and vertebrae piled in the corners like cordwood.